I'm Autumn Lockett,
And this is Mitch Randall.
and you're listening to Good Faith Weekly.
Welcome to Good Faith Weekly, and on this episode, Autumn and I will catch up. We're going to talk about Virginia's decision to abolish the death penalty, talk a little bit about the mass shootings that took place over a span of a week, both in Atlanta, Georgia, and Boulder, Colorado. And later in the pod, we're going to be interviewing Shauw Chin Capps from the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship and talk about violence against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. So stay tuned. It's going to be a good episode. Autumn, how are you doing this week?
I'm doing well. It is spring. Spring break is over. My kids are back in school. It wasn't like last year's spring break where they sent them home to us and then they were home with us until August. So I'm doing fabulous. How are you?
We're doing well. My wife and I are on the road this week in Dallas, Texas. I came down here for a quick overnight trip, so it's a little different. With being both vaccinated now, being down on the road and in a hotel, it's a little strange, but a little sense of normalcy. So that was nice.
Yeah.
But yeah, we're doing well. Sunshine down here. It's Thursday this week, and we want to say a prayer for our friends in the Southeast today, as they're going to be experiencing some bad weather later on today on Thursday. And when people will be listening to this, obviously it's going to be Friday. So we hope that everybody's able to stay safe and secure after the storms move through Mississippi and Alabama and Tennessee. So our prayers and thoughts go out to them.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, Autumn, lots of things in the news this week. Let's first start with Virginia's decision to abolish the death penalty. After years and years of people advocating for the abolishment of the death penalty, showing clear evidence of its racial prejudice against people of color, Governor Northam finally was able to sign legislation that abolished the death penalty, which was seen as a big win, especially for a southern state to do so.
Yes. The death penalty is one of those things that is a very hot button issue. People typically aren't sort of in the middle on that. They're either extremely pro or extremely anti. And I think it's tough because there is no doubt that there are crimes that happen that, you listen and they're heinous and it's open and shut. And you think that is a just reward for what you did.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, until our criminal justice system is 100% accurate, the death penalty is not fair. It's just not. Until we can prove, there's never any mistakes, there's no racial bias, we have, all of the evidence was collected fairly, representation was given, until it's completely fair and balanced, which, spoiler alert, it won't ever be. The death penalty just it's not just.
And you bring up a lot of interesting points, because if you think about it, would we rather put a murderer who's been convicted in jail for the remainder of their life without any hope of parole, or would we rather practice the death penalty and occasionally get it wrong and put somebody who's innocent to death? To me, you would always want to err on the latter side,
right?
Of okay, why? Because once you kill somebody, you kill them, you murder them, and it's over with. But if they're still alive and the justice system made a mistake, and guess what? The justice system makes mistakes, then they're able to be released and get on with the rest of their life. But once they have been executed, it's all over with.
Yeah.
And then the other point you make that I think is extremely important is that there is no evidence whatsoever to suggest the death penalty somehow convinces people not to commit murder. If that were the case, then there would be no murders in Texas and Oklahoma and states that pretty liberal with their death penalty and executions. And so, it's not a deterrent to heinous crimes. So the reality is, it really serves no purpose except it makes people feel better that somehow in their mind they are executing justice, when really what they're executing is revenge upon someone they believe has committed a crime against them and their family and their fellow constituents. And like we've already suggested, A lot of times that is incorrect. DNA has been able to prove that on several occasions. And then also, again, as you have stated, it's just so imbalanced, who gets executed and who does not. Not only in a racially biased way, but also in a socioeconomic way. Because if you're wealthy in this country, there is a strong likelihood you are not going to be executed because you're able to put a legal defense that will provide you, at the very least, life imprisonment if you committed this crime or convicted of this crime. But if you are a person of color or a person of poverty, then there's a strong likelihood if you get charged with a crime that would put you on death row, you're going to be executed because you have no way to defend yourself.
Exactly. And there's also the whole element of it doesn't save the government any money because the trials and all of the work that goes into actually putting someone to death. I mean, sometimes it can take up to 25 years for that to happen by the time you get through all the appellate situations. And the other piece of that is all of the folks who are a part of that execution and the impact it has on them. Just because that's your job doesn't mean that that's something that you support or that's a choice that you want to live with for the rest of your life. And so it has some really deep, philosophical and ethical implications beyond just the person who you put to death. And so I just think it's a dark mark on our country, and I'm so thankful to see places like Virginia starting to move in the right direction.
Absolutely. Well, speaking of dark marks, the country has now suffered again two terrible tragedies involving gun violence and mass shootings. One occurred last week in Atlanta, Georgia. 8 people were gunned down at 3 spas that were owned by Asian Americans. It seems as though the gunman was targeting Asian-owned businesses. 6 of the 8 people that were killed were of Asian descent. And then this week, attention was turned to Boulder, Colorado, when a gentleman walked inside at the grocery store there in Boulder and began shooting his AR-15, killing 10 individuals. I just continue to shake my head. I've said it till I'm blue in the face. And we've gotten into this secular type of debate where these shootings take place. There's a quick denouncement of these acts. Liberals want gun legislation. Conservatives say now is not the time. And the ball rolls on. The days roll on until another shooting happens. It's a horrible, horrible predicament we are in because nothing is getting done. Absolutely nothing. And people continue to suffer at the hands of gun violence. And I don't know what else to do. I mean, if you're looking at me right now, my hands are up. I don't know what else to do.
Shoulders are in his ears. He's just really unclear. And I get it. I'm a Texas girl. I grew up in a house where there were deer heads mounted on the walls in my living room. My first word as a child was dia because there were deer heads everywhere. I come from a family who chews tobacco and shoots things and has red Solo cups and fish fries. Like, I get it. But here's the situation. They don't need an AR-15. Like, that's bananas. Like, that is a war like machine. It's not for killing a deer. It's not for hunting raccoons or whatever you're going to do. It's for killing people. It is just for killing people. And it's absurd that they're still legal.
Right. And the situation in Boulder, it would seem like if AR-15s, assault rifles were outlawed, that certainly would have prevented that shooting from taking place, even though there's a lot of
so many others.
And so many others. But they're also, they would literally have to be outlawed because what happened in the Clinton administration when there was assault weapons ban, that they grandfathered so many in that there was still this huge population of AR-15s in circulation. That eventually somebody's going to have to step up and show leadership on this and say, this is not the kind of weaponry that needs to be in the hands of the general population. No. This is a warlike weapon that, rightly so, soldiers, the military, trained individuals should have access to in warlike situations. But the average, the average citizen does not need this. There's already limitations to warlike weaponry. I mean, nobody can go down to Walmart and buy a tank. And, so I mean, it's just there are already bans when it comes to military grade weaponry, and I think this needs to be added to that list, and they need to go away. Now, in a circumstance in Atlanta, there's a little different circumstance. That seems to be a situation where the Asian community was targeted by an individual who was having a bad day, using the words of the local sheriff there in town, but also this
Careful.
ramification, the consequences of a purity culture that suggests that he could not help himself because he was so tempted by his sexual desires that he had to take out that frustration on the women that he was being tempted by. And it just asinine, and just this horrible attempt at justifying or at least I don't know what you would say, easing the responsibility that this person has on doing what they have done. The gunman walking into these Asian-owned businesses and causing such havoc. So just horrible, and I'm fed up with it. I've said it again. I've said it before. I'll say it again. Unfortunately, we'll have to say it again several more times. I'm just absolutely fed up with it.
Yeah, it's absurd.
Absolutely. Well, later on in the pod, you and I sat down with Shauw Chin Capps from the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship. Shauw Chin is of Asian descent. She talks a little bit about her feelings when she heard what took place in Atlanta, Georgia. Her and her family live in Atlanta. Talks a little bit about what it was like growing up and then immigrating to the United States, and everything that she had heard about the West. And it's just a really enlightening conversation. So I hope that you're able to stay and listen to our interview with Shauw Chin Capps right now.
Lot Carey is proud to bring you conversations with some of the best and brightest pastors coast to coast. Our new podcast, Pilgrimages of Striving and Thriving, delivers wisdom from the Black church for the whole church. Find us wherever you get your podcasts, or listen online at lotcarey.org. That's LOTTCAREY.org. We look forward to the pilgrimage with you.
Welcome back to Good Faith Weekly. And we've got a very special guest with us today, Shauw Chin Capps. Last week, Robert Aaron Long, a young white male, drove to 3 spas near Atlanta, Georgia. He walked into each and opened fire, killing 8 people, 6 of Asian descent. While the United States has a concerning history in our treatment of Asian immigrants and citizens, there's been an upward trend in violence that has developed over the last several years, especially during this last year in a global pandemic. We're very fortunate to have Shauw Chin with us today. She is the Foundation President and Chief Development Officer for the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship in Atlanta, Georgia. She provides overall leadership and management of the work of the CBF Foundation and CBF's fund development strategies. She came to faith as a result of the work of Baptist missionaries in Singapore. She's also a graduate of Baylor University and of the Carver School of Social Work. Shauw Chin, thank you for being with us today, and welcome to Good Faith Weekly.
Thank you, Mitch. Thank you for inviting me today.
Yes, we're so thankful that you're here. And just before we get started, can you tell us a little bit about your family story and your heritage?
Yeah, sure. I would be considered first generation Asian here in America. I actually immigrated from Indonesia, Jakarta, Indonesia, which is where I was born. That is where my parents met, got married. My father was originally from China. He actually escaped World War II to Jakarta, Indonesia. His parents had during the war basically forced him to leave as a way of surviving, to make sure that the family survives. And at 13, he jumped onto a train and headed to Jakarta, Indonesia, where they knew they had an uncle there. And so an uncle basically adopted him. And so starting at 13, that's where he grew up, was in Jakarta, and met my mother in Medan, Jakarta, which is a region in Jakarta, and they got married there. And basically, we all four of us, four girls, were born in Jakarta, Indonesia. And like any Chinese family, traditional Chinese family, they were very focused on education, really valued education because of that value that they had and the desire for their children to succeed in life. They really was seeking the best education system for their four girls, and decided that neighboring Singapore was a good place to send their kids to go to school. So my parents basically took all four of us to Singapore for the sole purpose of gaining a good education there. And both received permanent residency there. So we basically had two homes. We grew up in Singapore, but we also had a home in Jakarta and would visit Jakarta during school vacation. So I spent really, I would say, most of my formative childhood, growing up years, all the way through high school in Singapore, which is a multi-racial, multi-ethnic country. And when I graduated from high school in Singapore, again, following kind of the path of traditional Chinese family, again, wanting to have the best education, and my parents believing that going to America would be the best route for their children. All four of us were sent to the United States, to colleges, to get our college degree. So that's how I landed as an international student initially with an F1 visa. First to Bloomington, Indiana, attending Indiana University, and transferred to Baylor University, graduated my undergrad at Baylor, and then went on to Southern Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky for my master's in social work through the Carver School of Church Social Work. So that's kind of, in a nutshell, sort of my background. And I married a missionary kid.
Wow.
And it happens to be the Baptist missionary that were responsible for helping me come to know Christ and discipled me afterwards. And all that was not planned. And got a green card, went through the whole green card process. Sure. And became a U.S. citizen, I believe 4 years later. So about 2000 was when I was sworn in to become a U.S. Citizen. So
nobody warned you about marrying an MK?
No one. Well, my parents did.
Wise parents.
My parents, basically, I said my husband, his name is Paul, had 3 strikes against him. He was a missionary kid. He was poor. And coming from a traditional Chinese family, being white was also not a readily acceptable, interracial was not readily acceptable. So he had 3 strikes against him.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your story. Wow,
yeah,
just a great story. Thank you again for sharing it with us. Now, obviously, we're here under a very a cloud of darkness, really, to be quite honest with you. The horrendous events that unfolded last week around Atlanta, Georgia. When you first heard about the attacks in Atlanta on Asian Americans, as an immigrant, now as an Asian American citizen, what first came to mind when you heard the news?
Yeah, that's interesting. It seems like a blur now when I thought about it. It was, when I woke up that morning and saw it in my news feed, my Apple app news feed. I had to kind of pause. I was shocked, but at the same time, not shocked, where I was telling myself in my head, I was thinking, it's okay, it's happening now. Like, it's almost like something that I knew was sort of pending, like, and then felt the sort of confirmation, okay, this is real and this is happening now. And of course, part of that, most of us have heard of the increasing violence against the Asian American community, especially as during as the start of the pandemic, with all that, there's been all the reports that I've been hearing and the stories that maybe people are not as familiar with, but there's been, many reported incidents of individuals and even elderly Asians who are shoved to the ground and,
Sure.
all these things. And so it's kind of almost a culmination where I was shocked, sad, but also was like, okay, it's confirmation. This
Right.
is
Sure.
real, because I think there's always a part of me that wanted to believe it's not real and that it was not going to come to this.
Sure.
Right. So
those initial reactions were one of really, as you, in your words, shock and surprised, but then in just as quickly, you began to realize, okay, this is the byproduct of what, my ancestors, my relatives have been experienced for quite some time. This is the outcome of bigotry and racism in this American experiment. And so, so that's interesting.
Yeah. And it's also, I think, how quickly the story unfolded too, with the information that came out, the details about the shooter and his sex addiction and all, sort of also culminated with all the sort of stereotypes and the, I don't know how to put it, but the objectification of Asians in the media, in general public, about how we're viewed, all that sort of came to a head for me, with all the details of this shooter. And it was very disturbing. The quick dismissal of it's not a racial crime was very, from someone who's Asian listening to that, it's just really unbelievable to think about, wait, we have this culture that we believe in the words of a murderer over the 6 Asian women that are lying dead in front of us. It's just mind-boggling. For me, it was so obvious. How can it not be racially motivated?
Right.
We
Yeah.
have 6 Asian women who were targeted and 3 Asian spas, not just any spas,
Right.
like Asian spas, all these things that was so obvious to me. It was mind-boggling. It was hard to kind of grasp and understand what was really going on.
Yeah, it was startling. And your words earlier, I think, probably better sets the tone. It was startling, but then after just a brief moment, you go, well, yeah, this is the way, especially white Anglo conservative culture reacts to this. They quickly begin to dismiss the racial overtones of this crime and these murders, and tried to shift the blame for a sexual temptation that this young man had. Yeah, a sexual addiction that this young man had. It was just, I mean, like mind-boggling, mind-blowing. But this is what, this is what a white patriarchal society has been doing for centuries. And making excuses for this kind of behavior and dismissing this kind of behavior and shifting the blame from the person's bigotry and racism to somehow he was tempted beyond his ability to restrain himself. It's just crazy.
Which further makes the objectification of these women even greater. They were just temptations. It's all that kind of messaging. I think people don't realize how powerful that can be in how we start to view victims. I've worked with victims for 20 plus years too, and that's an old playbook. Of victim shaming and if they're prostitutes or they're sex workers, it shifts people's thinking, and it was so, for me, it was so obvious with how things shifted so quickly with, focusing on his sex addiction and then objectifying these women as the targets of his addiction. In other words, blaming them for, his, what he's done. And so it's all, there's a lot of intersections, of course, of racism here, but also we can't dismiss the gender-based violence here too, which I think is another really important topic and probably can go on talking for a long time with that. And also the other piece has to do with, our culture's obsession with our rights to own guns. And, those three big issues, I think, sort of coalesce with this specific this shooting here.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, unfortunately, as Mitch and I were preparing for this interview, we were making sure we had the most up-to-date facts. And since we scheduled this interview, there's been another shooting.
That's right.
And
Colorado.
it's yes, I mean, it's just absurd. And I've seen some people comparing, that you can't register to vote and vote on the same day in Georgia, but
Correct.
you could
Yep.
purchase a firearm all in one day.
Yep. And I mean, that's exactly what the shooter did.
Mm-hmm.
He purchased a gun, and within however many hours, he took that gun and did his thing.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So, so there's the intersectionality of all those three big topics, I think, is key in discussing this particular shooting. And we shouldn't minimize any one of those. I know that, right now we're sort of talking about the racial aspects of it, but I think the other pieces are just as important.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And just percolating underneath all of that is that words matter.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
That when leadership of this country began spouting ignorance about, calling the virus based on where it originated,
Right.
that it's been snowballing now for a while, which I think led to what you and Mitch have described as, of course, horror at this act, but not exactly shocked, because we've seen this drumbeat since all of this began.
Right. Yep. Yeah. And there's no question that any president's rhetoric, I don't care if it's Trump or anyone, can have rippling effects, right?
Sure.
And
Absolutely.
but I think it's also important to realize that certainly to solely blame Trump on this would be also naive on our part.
Sure.
And because, if you look at our country's history with how Asian Americans have been treated historically, I think it paints the picture for us that this is something that has been going on for a long time, that such violence and racism and discrimination have been going on for a long time. And really what Trump did was simply, I hate to say this, he's sort of the symptom of a much bigger problem that we all have a part to play in.
Mm-hmm.
So I think in some ways, we have to be careful, I think, with just blaming him, because then it's a cop-out, because then it washes our hands off. It's just all Trump. Whereas all of us, I think, have a role to play. More importantly, a role to play in ending such violence and taking the steps.
And ending it before it gets to the violence, right?
That's
so
right.
When I hear someone in my circle using language that I know is offensive and harmful, and could, radicalize someone, to stop it, even if it's uncomfortable, and to try to educate from a place of love. And then if not of love, maybe a little bit of elbow grease.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I call it the importance of developing muscles to notice harm before it boils into something tragic like this.
Oh, I love that. You're
think
such a social worker. I love it.
I feel like we need to do some weightlifting. We're so fragile when it comes to our willingness to have difficult conversations, our willingness to confront, right? It's this whole idea of being an active bystander that actually has been proven to be one of the most effective way to prevent any kind of violence.
Sure.
Is being an active bystander, whether it's sexual violence, domestic violence, this type of violence, and it goes with the rhetoric piece too, and be willing to say, hey, even you don't have to be an expert in all these topics. You don't have to be completely woke and know all the different things to talk about. All you know is if you know your gut tells you this is not right, this feels dehumanizing.
Right.
And you know you have a Black friend, a brown friend, an Asian friend, and you think about them, bring their faces to your minds, and you think about they're going to be hurt if they hear this, then you should be saying something. Even if it's a simple, you know what, you shouldn't be saying that because that's hurtful or that's harmful. And that's it. That could disrupt an entire kind of conversation that could lead to further harm, right? So just the idea of being an active bystander and disrupting the cycle, whether it's a conversation or whether it's an act, I think it's so important for us to learn.
Shauw Chin, that is, you've made so many important points just now. And the one that I want to focus in on now is, you mentioned that America has had a long history of prejudice and bigotry towards Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. And while certainly the cases in violence have increased over the last year, some 149%, this is not new.
Right.
This has happened throughout the history of the United States, and when Asian descendants began to immigrate here to the States. Now, growing up, or when you arrived here as an immigrant, and now you have conversations, with children, with the next generation of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders who are growing up in this country, we often hear from our African American colleagues about the talk. The talk about what it's like to or have to grow up as a black or brown person. Do those kind of conversations happen within the Asian community? And when, what are you taught as an Asian, a person of an Asian ancestry and an Asian American? What do you teach the next generation of what it means to be both of Asian descent as well as an American citizen?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I think I know actually that there is a generational divide when it comes to the AAPI community, when it comes to, confronting racism. And part of that has to do with the historical kind of narrative here, and how the sort of title of model minority has been relegated to the Asian American community. I think the older generation, like, my parents, for example, a great example is when my parents heard that I went to the march and rally this Saturday in Atlanta. Their first instinct was, you shouldn't do that.
Yeah.
Right. One of the speakers at the rally, an Asian speaker, an Asian woman, said she's here today and speaking out, but her parents don't know she's there, because they would be absolutely devastated that she's there. So there's a real, I think part of it is perhaps also our cultural upbringing, and don't make waves, just comply, and just work hard, stay under the radar. Those are sort of things that we've been taught, and I think that's difficult to break through. And generationally, I think there's a divide between how the younger generation responds to this and how the older generation responds. So I wasn't necessarily taught like what to do, because my parents were never in America.
Right.
I was taught about Western culture. They don't necessarily have a very positive view about Western culture. In fact, one of the struggles that I had in becoming a Christian was my parents really didn't want me to be a Christian, because they equated Christianity to Westerners. It's the religion of the Western people.
Right.
And so the way they equate that is seeing it as an abandonment or betrayal of my traditional Chinese roots, which of course it's not what my faith is about. It's not what it means to be a follower of Jesus, but that is their view, right? So it's really hard to kind of break that that view that they have, the connection that they make between Christianity and being the religion of the white people, essentially. Well, and understandably so,
Sure.
right? With
Yeah, absolutely.
there are reasons for that, and good reasons. But I think with my own kids, I think now that I myself had to educate myself, reading about, what the experiences of the Chinese immigrants, Asian immigrants in the U.S. starting from the 1850s, when the first wave of, Chinese laborers, the railroads, they were cheap labor, they were seen as threats to white people's jobs, and they were scapegoated. They were, targeted as dirty. The whole term of yellow peril came from that, and then leading to the Chinese Exclusion Act. All those things that have happened. I think it's important for our younger generation to know that there is a narrative here, that this is historically this has happened, that has brought us to where we are today, and that if we're not aware of what happened and the history of it, then we're gonna be ignorant about how to really confront it and how to find the solutions, and work for a better, more equitable world, not just for AAPI community, but really for all of our POCs, right?
Sure. So now, before we let you go and ask our final question, I just want to ask you, do you see hope? Obviously, we're living in under a very dark cloud right now after the events of last week. But are there signs of hope for us?
Yes, absolutely. And I can tell you that one of the biggest signs of hope for me is my own two girls. Once in college, a junior in college, and once a junior in high school, and their sort of level of activism is admirable. And I'm being completely honest here, I have learned so much from them. They have taught me about the depth of their knowledge about systemic racism is impressive. I think we have so much to learn from the younger generation, and I'm grateful. That's where I see the hope, and the way that they're able to make connection. My youngest junior in high school, just understanding the connection between power, who you vote, and the importance of voting, and who you put in position of power to make policies is impressive, right? And she was she engaged in a local organization that was advocating to help people register and fill out the census. How many American adults understand the connection between census, filling out the census, and voting, right?
Sure, yeah.
And she was, doing that. And so that's the biggest sign of hope for me, is the next generation. And I hope that they will lead us, and I hope that we will have the humility to let them lead. And there's also hope in terms of, our faith community, within the CBF community, and seeing the outpouring of support, and the pastors and ministers who are willing to take the risk to address this from the pulpit. And my challenge for them is to really seek out a much more holistic discipleship. A sermon from the pulpit alone is not going to change people. It needs to be part of congregational life, right? And I hope, my hope is that the faith community can be a part of this change too. And I definitely have seen positive signs in that area too, even though there are absolutely still a lot more work to do. So those are just some pieces that I wanted to share in terms of the hope that I see.
I love it.
Yeah.
I mean, we echo those same words. We've been saying it over and over again. This next generation just sees and does life entirely different than the rest of us.
Oh my goodness. And let me tell you, they don't take any BS. I mean,
they do not.
It's not even emotional for them. My
gosh, they are so like,
there's like, oh no, it's this.
Yes,
It's racist. And here's why. And I don't care if you are my grandpa
And even for me as a social worker, sometimes I'm even like, oh my gosh, that sounds, but I'm like, I admire that. I'm like, my gosh, there's no BS. It's just like,
that's right.
racist.
That's exactly right.
They call it what it is.
TikTok empowered.
That's exactly right.
And I just love that. That to me is just, and just having these two young people, just gives me a lot of hope. And even though I didn't do much in terms of helping them, I mean, they just seem to get it, and it's kind of part of the DNA, which I really just appreciate and am very grateful for.
Well, thank you so much for being with us today. Before we let you go, though, Autumn's got one final question for you.
Yeah.
Our tagline at Good Faith Media is "There's more to tell." So in light of everything we've talked about today, what is your more to tell?
My more to tell is to not lose hope, to be an active bystander, that wherever you are, you can be that change. And sometimes it just takes one word from you, whether it's stop it, don't do that. It can be as simple as just a few words to disrupt this vicious cycle of racism and violence. So I would encourage anyone, whatever role you play, whether you're a pastor, a minister, a lay person, that you allow your faith to give you the courage to do what is right. So that's my last word.
Shauw Chin Capps, thank you so much for being with us today. For those of you who want to know more about the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship, you can check them out at cbf.net, and they're doing a lot of good work around the world. And we appreciate you being here, even though they are under this circumstance. You have given us hope today, and thank you so much for that.
Oh, thank you so much, Mitch and Autumn. It's been a pleasure.
Shauw Chin, thank you so much for joining us with Good Faith Weekly. And to our listeners, we just want to say thank you for listening. And until next time, keep living good faith.